Based on a Ferrari 458, NZXT's newest full-size ITX tower, the Manta, has just launched today, and we've got the review in with thermal benchmarks, build quality analysis, and more. NZXT says its bubbled case with rounded exteriors is inspired by the Ferrari 458, and you can see that in some of these photos where we've got both of those things together. Definitely an uncommon occurrence. The new Manta uses stamped curved steel paneling all around, which, as far as we're aware, is the first case to use the stamped and curved steel side paneling. It is an all-steel enclosure with all-steel external paneling and uses some plastic reinforcement and clips in a few other places. The full-size ITX tower sells at $140, ships with two front 120mm fans and one rear 120mm fan. It's got support for, alternatively, two 140mm front fans if you want to replace them or put a radiator in there, two 140mm or 120mm top fans, and then you can fit up to 280mm radiators in the top and front or 120 in the rear. CPU clearance is good for 160mm coolers. The curved exterior is obviously the biggest feature here and a bit of a risk for NZXT. You can see they've gone with their trend of axing the 5 1/4 drive bays, something that I definitely agree with and allows this full ITX form factor. But in terms of whether you like the rounded edges or not is really up to you, not me, so I will leave that to the video and photos to discuss. In terms of actual component features, there's a fan hub on the rear side of the motherboard tray over here, and that's a pretty smart inclusion because with ITX cases, you're going to have an ITX motherboard, and those generally have maybe one or two fan headers. So that is a big limitation with ITX boards, and by adding a fan hub in their stock, they can take care of that immediately. There's also an LED controller for the PSU shrouds NZXT illuminated text, which is something that's been done since maybe the H440, I think, may have been the first one to institute that, and the S340 has carried that on with the Noctis 450 following after the S340. So it's got the PSU shroud. Unlike the previous cases I just named, there are no SSD sleds on top of the PSU shroud, and that's because of the proximity of the video card. There's basically no clearance. However, the top of the PSU shroud has been changed so that it's got these sort of grilled drafts in the top instead, and that allows, in theory, a tiny bit of air to get through to the GPU. Now, it's not a lot, and if you look closely at the front of this case where the fans are installed stock, our setup has it so that the lower fan is actually halfway into the power supply shroud, and so you're funneling a lot of your air straight into a wall, basically. And then the top one is lower and in line with the exhaust fans. That one does make sense. I would move the front fans up a little bit, though, and we did actually test that, but we'll talk about that later. Speaking of tests, we did a lot of them with this case and we're pretty excited about it. This has a lot of tests on the fan position, size, and radiator location in the case, so you can see optimal fan setup in a case like this, but most of that will be in the article. Hit the link in the description below for that. We'll go over some of it briefly here in this video. Speaking to a few points about the case in terms of build quality, aesthetics, and overall feature set. The case is almost entirely made of steel with a few plastic inlays supporting the hardened shell, and it is very much like a turtle shell. It's sturdy, surprisingly heavy for the form factor, and inflexible, which is a good thing. Looking inside the outward bowed window, we see an interior that resembles a shrunken version of the S340 with PSU shroud, cable management bar, and cleared front for airflow and minimalism. The SSD sleds have been moved off that shroud and into the immediate east area of the cable management bar. Unfortunately, that actually restricts installation of non-SSD 2.5-inch form factor devices. So, for example, NZXT's Q Plus RGB LED controller does not fit in those two SSD sleds, and that is a huge oversight and a very unfortunate one because I really wanted to install it there to get sort of the NZXT look for, nice shots for video, but it didn't fit. Cable management cutouts exist in the usual places, including directly in the PSU shroud for routing the PCIe wiring straight to the GPU. Two other minor criticisms I have of the case immediately are the USB 3.0 front I/O. I think this may be either a factory defect or something else. That's probably not a wide issue, but the headers didn't line up perfectly with the top panel. So in order to get those to line up, we removed the top panel, not hard to do, and then just sort of warped the headers back into place so that USB 3 devices could actually be used. So that is a problem we've seen before in NZXT cases, and it's probably just a factory thing. The thumb screws are another factory issue for basically all the manufacturers at this point. Corsair and NZXT are the two big ones that I can think of where the thumb screws aren't really thumb screws because you have to use a screwdriver, but that is such a minor issue. We really can't dock any real points from it because you're building a system once and then you just hand tighten it next time. But I'm still mentioning it because I want to see NZXT and Corsair and all these other manufacturers actually fix it so their thumb screws are usable without the tool. That's not to speak ill of the case though, because there are a lot of good things about this case without even getting to the benchmarking. And one of those is just how sturdy the paneling is and how easy it is to remove. So the front panel, you just pull from the underside and it clips in with several plastic clips that are thick and won't break easily, which is a problem I've had with a lot of cases, the Corsair 400C included. That review is coming this week, where we snap the alligator clips that hold the paneling in place. So that didn't happen with this. It's very sturdy and it is somewhat reinforced, so I did not have to worry about that. The case is also exceptionally quiet, and this is something I wish we did benchmarking for, but decibel levels are one of the only factors in any type of component that we don't currently review because it's very hard to do accurately. If we can't do it accurately, we don't test it at all. Subjectively, I can tell you that the audio emissions, the noise emissions coming from this case are fairly low, and that's because of the thick steel paneling. There's obviously some pretty limited airflow here. The meshing only exists on the sides of the top and front panel, but that does give you some benefit of noise level control. So you trade off a bit of air for noise levels, and something like the Thermaltake Core V1, another mini ITX case, does the opposite. It's all mesh, so it's got superb airflow potential anyway, but it's a bit noisier. So there's a trade-off to be made there, and that is up to you to decide on what you want more. Let's get into the testing. All the test methodology is on the website. We use the Thermaltake Core V1, Rosewell Legacy W1, iBuyPower Revolt 2, which is not available separately, and the NZXT Manta for these tests. The first charts show thermals at equilibrium for only the Manta's fan configuration, so we don't have the competing cases on here just yet. After these, we'll move to the comparative analysis. First off, this matrix shows our testing configuration for the Manta-only benchmarks. The goal was to define the most effective fan and radiator configuration, and that's exactly what we tested here. For CPU temperatures, the triple exhaust configuration produces the lowest readings at 34 Celsius, though idle is noticeably higher at 15.2 Celsius. It does not necessarily follow that the coolest load configuration will produce the coolest idle configuration. There's a bit more involved than that. This is something we've seen in a few other cases as well, but correlating the triple exhaust setup to the GPU chart now, it becomes apparent that this is in fact one of the worst configurations possible because it pushes the GPU into the 71.4 Celsius delta T over ambient range, which means that once you factor in ambient, if we assume about 20 Celsius or 70 degrees Fahrenheit thereabouts, we've now got a GPU that is thermally throttling at 90 Celsius for absolute temperature, and that is not what you want. So we can't use the triple exhaust setup. That's not good for thermals. Conversely, the GPU is the coolest with 3 fan stock setups. So if you just use the 2 intake 120s, 1 rear exhaust 120, and the radiator configured in the rear, so it's not front mounted. In this instance, the GPU is at 63.2 delta T over ambient for Celsius readouts, and that's achievable because of 2 factors. One, the front intake is unobstructed and does not pass through a radiator, which obviously pushes a bit of heat into the case, though not much. And the exhaust is a single fan setup and not overpowering the blower fan's ability to cool itself, so it's not stealing air from the lower part of the case. This setup, though, is the worst for the CPU by a couple degrees, at least several degrees actually. The best setup overall that we found, if you're using a radiator anyway, is to run the 1x120mm top rear fan and a front radiator. So that gives the best value without going to a 5-fan setup, which is really pretty poor value overall because the thermal gains are marginal, it's kind of middle of the road, and it's more expensive. And it keeps the GPU temperatures at a superb 63.3 Celsius, which for a reference cooler is pretty good comparatively to cases of this size especially. It only raises the CPU to 37.08 Celsius, which is not bad for either, considering it's a case that focuses at least somewhat on silence and discretion. And since most radiators include a fan, it's likely that CLC users will be running 4 fans anyway. Let's move on to the comparative charts. Thermaltake's Core V1 is the best with both GPU and CPU thermals at equilibrium, producing 38.21 Celsius CPU temperatures against the Manta's 42.3 Celsius. The Legacy is only slightly warmer than the V1, but sits at significantly higher idle temperatures with a 5.1 Celsius readout. The differences between these cases are mostly inconsequential until we get to the Revolt 2, which we'll discuss in a future review. The GPU temperatures for the V1 are at 62.68 Celsius load and run pretty warm idle with an 8.44 reading. The idle readout is warmer than the others because Thermaltake relies upon the GPU to pull its own air, so it's got to pull its own weight as it's slightly off-center from the intake fan in the front. The Manta sits at 63.25 Celsius load, which is really not bad at all for a small case. It's barely more than the Thermaltake V1, which is pretty darn cool for, again, a small case. Overall, we've got nothing to complain about in terms of thermals for the most part, as long as you set it up right. Don't do the multi-exhaust setup though, because that one is a bit stressful for the GPU because it's siphoning all the air from it. And that's why these tests were fun to conduct, because we can look at the airflow patterns of different radiator setups and learn, for instance, that a front-mounted radiator is very efficient at keeping the CPU cool because it's pulling in fresh air from outside the case and pushing it through. Now, that pumps some heat into the case and it also obstructs intake a little bit, so that can impact the GPU. However, if we stick to just one fan in the rear exhaust slot, it doesn't steal air from the GPU and it's able to keep cool on its own just using the blower fan. So pretty interesting test. If you want to learn more about these tests, do check the article linked in the description below. Let's get to the conclusion though. At $140, the Manta is definitely a steep buy and in an odd market segment. Many ITX cases are competitive and tend to either be expensive, like the Silverstone SG08, or pretty cheap, like the Thermaltake Core V1, which is $50 right now. The Manta lands middle of the road in its price, just as it does with its size, and that's one of the most interesting points for the case. It's not a shoebox like something the SG10 or SG08 are from Silverstone, or the Core V1, not quite a shoebox, but definitely smaller. And it's also not a mid-tower like NZXT's S340. So where does that put it? It puts it in this sort of strange full ITX tower category, which is not to say it's bad or unusable, just that it's different. And that means that for me personally, I would not have this in a home theater setup. I'd go for something smaller, again, like Silverstone options or any number of other small ITX boxes that are more shoebox sized. That's what I would go with for a home theater setup where I want absolute discretion and out of sight, out of mind type of setup for the enclosure. For something like a literal desktop computer like this, being on a literal desk, it does start to make sense, and the S340 would fit on a desk as well for the most part. But if you're looking for minimalism, you don't care about the extra drive bays, you don't care about the extra space for an ATX form factor motherboard, and you want an ITX setup that's, I guess, a little bit more portable, like this is, then it's not a bad buy at $140. It's certainly somewhat expensive. It enters the enthusiast range, but the materials are all very heavy-duty steel. It's a quality construction, and personally speaking, I think that it looks good. I was originally a pretty vocal I was not for or against the design. In articles in the past, I referred to this as the whale because I thought it looked like a bloated whale, but that was used somewhat in jest because we didn't have a name for the case yet, so we had to call it something, and whale just stuck for a one-syllable easy name. And I will say that the sort of wide-angle lenses we use don't do the case justice. It's not nearly as warped as it may look in some shots you'll see online, depending on what kind of lenses people are using, but it is absolutely bowed outward a little bit, and if you don't like that, that's completely fine. Don't buy it. Buy something that's a little more boxy instead, or whatever suits your taste. So that is the one point here that I would say is a potential negative for most people, because thermals are fine. They're not amazing, nothing to write home about, but they're not bad. And the form factor is a bit strange, but again, not bad. So it's just in an odd market segment, but the look is something that is either yes or no. So that is ultimately the deciding factor. And then of course, $140 is pretty deciding too. So that's all for this review. Hit the link in the description below for more information, and hit that Patreon link in the postal video if you want to help us out directly. Thank you to all of you who do help and who are subscribers, and I'll see you all next time.